As the sun rose above the wall, it was just another peaceful morning in a post-apocalyptic metropolis. Concealed by fog and automobile exhaust, the city appeared unremarkable at first sight. Close inspection, however, revealed a high wall encircling the city, reminiscent of a medieval castle. There was no sign of disturbance, and the scene appeared tranquil. What, though, may the locals be trying to conceal? Our hero had his unruly locks trimmed at Tony's barber shop. The barber was cutting the hair with deft precision, and would soon be done. The news was playing softly in the background, stating that many departments' analyses suggested that terrorists might soon attack the city. Government officials had already dispatched hunters to the area to make sure everyone was secure, so there was no need to fear, they said. If the ground was truly secure, Tony argued, the wealthy wouldn't be constructing floating towns to evade taxation. The protagonist agreed with the barber that he was correct, but the latter warned him not to move his head lest he accidentally sever an unintended limb. The hero was deep in contemplation, his mind racing. Even the government's advance warning of impending terrors was the biggest favor they could provide, in his opinion. In order to escape the mayhem below, the world's rich and powerful had constructed their own unique flying cities high in the sky. Then, out of nowhere, he claimed that even that will soon be over. The barber was so taken aback by his statements that he ceased cutting his hair in shock. Tony, the barber, warned him not to act foolishly anymore, expressing his hope that this kind of thing would never occur so long as they had hunters in their abilities. He was curious about terrors because he had never seen one in person. As our hero gave him the evil eye, he replied, laughing, that those were the most terrible monsters he had ever seen. A government commercial offering a 60% discount on funeral plans in the event of a terror-related death was airing on television during their conversation. As Tony casually proceeded with the haircut, our hero pondered whether he would ever face the terrors. But as soon as he finished speaking, a thin and perfect blow sliced through his head and the entire building. Blood splattered everywhere as his head shattered into two pieces. The city was in complete disarray as our hero remained still in his chair. Buildings were crumbling due to someone's tremendousness. It came to light that the cuts weren't performed with blades or any other kind of weapon. Rather, they were made with enormous shears wielded by some repulsive hand. Standing over Tony's lifeless body, the monstrosity chuckled gleefully. Its limbs were actually scissor blades, not arms or legs. It licked the blood-stained blades, and, in an ironic move, apologized for injuring him by accident. Since he was the one who had fired her, she leaned over him to inquire if he had forgotten about her. The client remained seated on the chair, and she soon became tired of chatting with the dead. When she heard there was another client to play with, she shouted with excitement. As she approached him, her menacing grin spread over her face as she inquired whether he was scared of her, or if he would also like her to practice on him. Then he yelled out, "My hair," and his face twisted into an angry scowl. When Tony severed the excess, he lost his composure and became enraged. She assured him she would repair it, and the monster was taken aback by his actions. She couldn't believe he was worried about all this right now. She promised herself that she would be gentler with his body this time. She began to clench her scissors, intending to chop off his head as well. Screaming Tong's name, he summoned his helper, knowing that if he did nothing, he would meet the same fate as Tony. She showed there right away and wanted to know how many times she had to urge him to stop calling her. Suddenly, what seemed like a terrifying swarm of live growths encircled his arm, and a single eye sprang from one of those growths. Next thing he knew, he was dodging the scissor attack and swiftly retrieved a katana from a growth on his arm. The katana, which was one of Tong's talents, simultaneously chopped everything, which is why she rightfully demanded to be labeled as her. Without hesitation, our heroine wielded it and mercilessly dismembered the creature with her terrifying shears. Lightning bolts of red and black radiated from the monster's wounds as it screamed in disbelief. At that point, our hero stopped caring about her. To keep from getting soiled, he put on his hood and prepared to go. The creature then unleashed a torrent of blood, drenching everything in its path. Her life had come to an end. Our hero began to remove his hood and apologize, saying, I'm sorry I cut your flesh on purpose." However, Tong slapped him for his pitiful behavior and warned him to quit acting so cool. Following this, she arrogantly demanded to know how many times she had to remind him to address her as Mrs. Sir. But our hero never learned his lesson and kept annoying her with, "Well, Tong, no problem." This gallantry caused Tong's helmet to light up with anger, and she inquired if he was ready for a confrontation. The name of our protagonist was. Tong was giggling and exclaiming, "What a hairstyle!" She thought it was cute on Leon, a degraded terror hunter, as he stared at his unkempt locks in the mirror. Members of the so-called Terror Hunters Squad are ranked by the government according to their effectiveness in the battle against terrorism. However, our hero stood out from the crowd since, in addition to that, he was a space traveler. Leon was being urged by Tong to not waste any time and absorb the force of the terror faster. He swept down terror with his katana and the monster's strength started seeping into him instantly. This was yet another aspect of his transformation from a modern man into a warrior against terror. So, he was rightfully entitled to his own system, wherein Tong, who thoroughly enjoyed it all, absorbed every terror he vanquished. After soaking up the terror's power, Tong could tailor its arsenal to its own specifications. But the terror was so feeble that it yielded almost no useful information. Our hero gazed attentively at one of the floating towns as Tong soaked in the last power of the terror. He thought about how he would never want to follow in the footsteps of the other adventurers who murdered terrors for the sake of glory, fortune, and power. After 5 long years of hard effort, he finally wanted to finish his job, put an end to it all, and return to his peaceful homeworld. A part of him longed for the days of being with his parents and siblings, particularly his younger sister, who had been abducted right before his eyes 5 years earlier. Even though he couldn't do anything at the time, he was now hell-bent on finding his younger sister Yik. But Tong, exhaustingly pointing out that he should have quit sucking the monster's last juices long ago, interrupted his thoughts and memories. Lian pulled out his katana and a dried body, and he asked Tong how many terrors he needed to kill to get home. The only thing he could say was ouch. Tong checked the information window and saw that he had slain 9,995 terrors, leaving him with only 5 to finish the main task. Reflectively, Lian said, the last 5. With a little more work, he could escape this awful world. As if in reaction, 5 terrifying monsters that annihilated everything in their path crept up on him from behind. The news stories concerning these terrors were the exact same ones. Behind him, the hero heard another piercing news report, this time from the already broken city, informing the citizens of City A that the terrors, who were en route to City C, had suddenly reversed their course and were urging everyone to gather in the shelters. There was one more, very important thing our hero had to complete before he could go confront the terrors. After he laid him to rest, after rewarding him for his devoted devotion, he fashioned a makeshift tomb for a barber from a building fragment and inscribed, "Here lies poor Barber Tony." The two of them would then confront the terrors side by side. With more enthusiasm than ever before, Lian entered this conflict. He had longed to return home for quite some time, and these were the final terrors. Finally, the day had arrived, or so he thought. However, panic had gripped the city center before to our hero's arrival. With cries of "The terror is here, and I do not want to die," the terrified populace did their best to flee. People were nothing more than helpless insects in the eyes of the terrors, who were cruel toward anyone who could not manage to flee. Even those who appeared to have gotten away were taken in by the merciless terror as it unleashed its destructive power on them. Some were lucky enough to stave off the terror's eyes by hiding among the rubble, but even they knew this was it. For them, this time meant certain doom. The regular people now had no chance of survival, even though their protectors, the guardians of the city Wan Fu, also known as Feet Without a Shadow, and Tom Ak, a catman, had been vanquished. Their city would be decimated by the terror. One survivor, though, gave the others reason to be hopeful. 3 hunters had visited their village before this attack. An iconic figure and a promising newcomer to the scene was among them. With yellow lightning bolts encircling him, he was already making his way to the battleground. A cloud of dust and lightning was raised as he descended onto the battlefield, precisely between the terrors and the fleeing people. With a sense of confidence and eagerness for the fight, the hero set out for the battlefield. He said that he wasn't exactly tardy, and that the moniker Lightning 1L was not an accident. By counting them theatrically on his fingers, he discovered that there were 5 terrors. After that, he made the exuberant announcement that he would undoubtedly advance in rank today after he vanquished everyone. A cloud quickly descended upon him, though, so he could not revel for long. Crushing down on this conceited bug was the shadow of a terror's foot. The hero had just been there, and now it spewed stones in every way as it roared its entire destructive might onto the area. However, when the terror was taken aback to discover that the area was deserted as soon as the dust settled, he was perplexed as to why his victim had vanished. The hero, who had already caught up to him, informed the monster that he was moving too slowly. The hero was already engulfed in lightning bolts as he prepared to launch a counterattack. His speed was like lightning as he charged at the enemy, and in an instant his strike connected with the horror squarely. Clouds of smoke and dust obscured the battlefield, making it impossible to see. The remaining townsfolk, however, started to shout with delight even before they could see the impact. They believed their plight was over, and that a champion had vanquished the initial menace. A member of the group concealed among the rubble began to retrieve a book from his rucksack and informed their comrades that this savior was the government's most renowned up-and coming celebrity. That he could get his book at a bargain price before he became renowned made him very happy. Thought he was an amazing human being. Titled Terror Hunter, it was the 8th installment in the Hunter Guild's Terror Hunter series. This book originally cost 2,998, but he offered to buy it from him for 5,000 if he wanted it. Contained all ranked hunters, including those with Lightning 1L. At least in this situation, The second person told him to quit guessing. The next thing he knew, a look of pure terror crossed his face as he beheld the figure impaled by many tentacles, the same one who had just attempted to sell him the book. With the cries of "Die, human!" ringing out, another monster had discovered their hiding spot and was obliterating the remains of the body while the survivors frantically attempted to flee. With careful consideration, the monstrous being took up a book and started to read. He couldn't help but wonder if it was a hunting book. Did lower-class beings invent a new way to make themselves feel safe by pretending to win? From the ruins emerged the other creature that had been struck by the hero earlier. Even though he was mostly undamaged, he was enraged that the insects were resisting. The hero was infuriated by this display of contempt and demanded to know how they had the gall to degrade mankind in his presence. This cannot be tolerated. He began to encircle himself with lightning bolts and even bounced off the ground with them. He then leaped through the air, concentrating his might into a single punch with his right hand. With a blue ball of lightning encircling his fist, he charged at the beasts. Surprisingly, despite the strike's intensity, it failed to provide the desired outcomes. Plus, even after channeling his entire strength into his thunderbolt, the monster was unhurt. He was in the midst of attacking one monster when another terrifying one appeared out of nowhere and was getting ready to strike. The monstrosity, which resembled a crab-limbed octopus with mutant mutations, emitted a blue energy beam from its jaws. This surprise attack was too much for even the swiftest hero Wangel to avoid, and he only just managed to deflect it. But it was of little use. He took the whole impact and bounced around on the rocks for a few dozen meters, looking like a ball. All the terrors surged towards him, their tentacles reaching out in an attempt to seize him, seeing this as a chance to attack. With each successive tentacle edging closer to its intended victim, Wangel hardly had time to duck and evade. Even blocking some of them was a challenge. The hero had no idea whether the monsters were related or why they had a common trait: bloody tentacles. But through it all, he had seen a monster standing aside, and he had a strategy. He thought to himself, "How clever," and grinned faintly. There were an excessive number of them, therefore, he should eliminate the weaker ones first. Swiftly evading the tentacle assaults, he unleashed a thunderclap. Then he vanished into thin air, leaving the four monsters to gaze at the lightning bolt's path. The hero charged at the monster that had stood aside, as those nightmares were bewildered. He had planned to attack and kill the mummy-like monster first, but it wasn't that helpless. Numerous hands and bandages hurried towards the hero the moment he was within striking distance. There was no time for anything because he was bound and gagged by many bandages. As he started to encircle himself with lightning, he grinned since he knew that fear couldn't hold him down with those awful bandages. Even with his maximum effort, it wasn't enough to set him free. Looking at the bandages, the hero couldn't believe what he was seeing. How were they going to take in all of his energy? How was it that this fear could exert such control? At the same time, the terror started biting the hero, who was bound closer and closer to him, as if he were going to kill him. Wangla, realizing his death was near, started to fight back with everything he had, but he was unsuccessful. After all, his physical strength and electricity were both being absorbed by the bandages. He could feel the other nightmares drawing near. He had come to terms with the fact that he was nearing death and that, at this point, nothing could rescue him. Regrettably, he expressed his belief that his hero career would continue indefinitely. Today, he was still unable to save anyone. When the survivors realized that not even the fabled Wang Lake could protect them from these terrifying monsters, they began to flee in terror. Our hero, meanwhile, appeared to be in high spirits and enjoying himself. At that moment, he relaxed as he rode his scooter, pleased that nobody had taken any of his treasure. Tong realized they could have arrived here a lot faster if he hadn't halted at each and every traffic signal. Regardless of how long it took, they eventually reached the battlefield. Upon witnessing the convergence of all these terrors, Tong couldn't help but smile gloatingly, relieved that they were all here. Given that this nut job had shown up here and had no idea what was going on, she was crossing her fingers that they were delicious. Someone yelled out to him, "Wangla, idiot, get out of here immediately or else you'll die." However, he was cut off in his tracks as the tentacles of a terror swept at the naive individual. One of the beasts was charging for him at breakneck speed, oblivious to any opposition, intent on getting a swift bite out of him. Our hero, however, was ready for it and told Wangla he could relax. A metamorphosis had started in his arm. The fear that had been contemplating a simple snack just moments before stared in dread at the enormous hand that was drawing near. Without any opportunity to evade, the hand snatched him by the unsightly eye and slammed down on him with such power that he crumbled to dust. Loon boasted that it was already a 9,996 monster, and that it was actually rather powerful. Muscle strengthening was the ability he utilized to defeat the beast. Without believing their eyes, the other heroes and terrors peered at him. How he could be so strong was a mystery to them. Was he actually a hunter of this rank? If that was the case, why was he completely unknown? While perusing a book that he had stolen from a local, One of the terrors even questioned our hero's identity. In response, our hero Loon revealed that he was a terror hunter. His arm felt normal again when he used the talent. In search of such a moniker, the monstrous creature began to thoughtfully peruse the book, but he came up empty-handed. As he seemed perplexed, Liz suggested that maybe he wouldn't be able to locate it in the book after all. He was only a D-rank night guard, and that the hunter ranks were the only ones mentioned. However, the other hero hated hearing this because he couldn't fathom how D-ranks got so powerful. He was just your average D-rank loser, so the monsters breathed a sigh of relief and assumed they could simply dispose of him. Then, our hero remained motionless while tentacles dove at him. All he did was inquire as to Tong's readiness. In response, she inquired as to his intended method of operation. The talent he loves the most. In an instant, a massive, strangely shaped sword materialized in his grasp, allowing him to slice through the swarm of tentacles hurtling towards him. However, that was merely the initial assault. There would be more. Subsequently, a mass terror scowled as it readied itself for its next trick. It started preparing an energy beam by sucking air into its enormous mouth. In preparation for defense, Loon knelt down and reached out to conjure a barrier. A red energy-reinforced stone wall stood before Loon as the monster gathered sufficient energy to open its enormous maw. Suddenly, a bluish-green energy beam swooped down on it. Despite the collision, the wall remained unmoving. Loon didn't spend any time getting ready for his surprise retaliation. He was preparing for an immediate surge, and the second the assault ceased, he reacted with lightning speed to launch an attack from the opposite direction. He had a katana in his hand already. To add another monster to his tally, he sprang far above it, and summoned the strength to chop it in half with a single strike. Just 3 remained. Seeing what happened to their buddy Terror, the remaining terrors were terrified just by looking at our hero. Instead of giving them a chance to regroup and formulate a strategy, Lu charged at them, admonishing them to continue the work of their fallen brothers. Initially, he aimed his attack at the black octopus, but its armor miraculously prevented his lethal blow from penetrating its flesh. Without believing what he was seeing, Lu gazed at the beast and his sword. It appeared as though his pity sword was unable to penetrate their armor, and the second monster had begun to chuckle at him about it. Tong was enraged by the derogatory term pity sword and vowed she would never again assume that form. On the contrary, she metamorphosed into a gigantic hammer, which Loon intended to employ without delay. Not only did the hammer destroy 2 beasts simultaneously, but it did it with enough force to raise a pillar of dust above the wreckage. Loon was displeased that he had ruined his clothing once more with this monstrosity. The neighborhood was affected as well. However, Tong told him that he was solely responsible. When Wangla saw this, he couldn't believe it and wanted to know how it was possible. Loon smugly explained that he had absorbed the abilities of every creature he had slain, but the hunter continued by asking, "Didn't hunters have just one ability? How could he use so many things?" Tong was already savoring the delectable feast in the background. Considering how out of the ordinary this was, even by Earth's norms, Loon found it hard to accept. As Loon was about to put an end to the final terror, the tongue in his palm transformed into. With a katana in hand, our hero charged the beast, declaring him to be the last of his kind. Wangla, however, told him to hold on. He cautioned him to exercise caution, saying that this terror was unique in that it had absorbed all of its force. Upon hearing this, Li confronted Tong, stating that her ability to absorb another person's power was somewhat similar to her own. However, she was reluctant to acknowledge the parallels and harbored resentment toward Tong, insisting that her strength was distinct from that monster's. Nevertheless, not even she could put her finger on what it was about this beast that seemed familiar. Li declared his win with conviction, saying that he was unconcerned about the monster's might as long as he could kill him and return to his previous existence. Without hesitation, our hero ran towards the beast and swore at him, telling him to burn in hell. In an effort to bind him, Terror hurled a plethora of bandages in his direction. Tong cautioned Li to exercise caution, but Li was prepared for the monster's assault, and ripped the bandages to bits with a series of lightning-fast actions. Those weren't going to be enough to deter a man as dashing as that. The only thing Li had to do to win was to stay away from those bandages. After that, the monster would be helpless against him. There must have been a purpose for Terror to absorb Wangla's power. Now he could channel it into his own actions. A deep scratch appeared on our hero's cheek as his lightning bolt nearly struck him. Unexpected as it was, Li was taken aback by the assault. It had almost killed him just now, Tong had reminded him. The fact that Li was aware of it allowed him to absolve himself, claiming he was merely being negligent. Worse yet, Wangla had never witnessed a terror wield another person's power before. This was the first instance of its kind. When Li saw he needed to get going faster, he had Tong craft him a pair of jet boots. Without hesitation, Li swung around to employ them, and he rocketed ahead. Relying on his lightning, fast reflexes, Li evaded Terror's stolen lightning technique. Just as he was about to reach his objective, a barrage of bolts of lightning exploded nearby. The terror appeared to be in a state of helpless reaction, his destiny seemingly decided for him. Without any hesitation, Lee was prepared to put an immediate end to everything with a single katana strike. What, though, caught him off guard when, out of nowhere, his katana froze only inches from its intended victim. In addition to halting his katana with an arm grab, terror had also seized both of our hero's legs, and now he possessed a death grip on him. He didn't merely hold it, he started absorbing its power right away. The effectiveness of his boots started to diminish after a short while. After Lee's boots absorbed the reactive power, Tan informed him of it. "I could see it myself," he said with a horrified tone. Right after he absorbed the power, terror planned to unleash it. He fashioned jet engines on his hands that matched the ones on our hero's boots, and he intended to crush our hero with them. Our hero's protective armor was struck by the hand. This ability was also quickly absorbed by terror. Tom warned Lee that this skill would be absorbed shortly as well, so he should move quickly. While soaking up his strength, the monster simultaneously pressed down from above with its reaction arm. Lee strained to maintain his grip, and the swelling in his arms caused them to rip his clothing. With a resounding crack, the monster's palm cemented his fortifications to the ground, leaving him with just enough time to leap out of their way. Lee had no choice but to concede that this terror was more powerful than he had anticipated. Tom boastfully said that they should probably retreat, because it would be considerably more difficult for him to go home now. Now Wangla shared this sentiment, as the terror appeared to be overwhelming. He suggested that our hero hold off on attacking the beast until the S-rank hunter arrived. Lee, nevertheless, was hell-bent on keeping his plane ticket to home to himself. He pondered strategies to vanquish the monstrosity that, after absorbing yet another ability, had conjured a shell-like defense. Terror approached our hero leisurely, using his numerous hands to hold his shell. Lee seemed to have finally figured out how to defeat this creature, as a contented grin spread across his face. Despite its ability to absorb other opponents' skills, this terror appeared to be lacking in human intelligence. Lee made a curious observation. The terror had to use his absorbed talent right away to make armored gauntlets for improved strikes. It was intriguing to see that the ability did not last long on this monster. Because of this knowledge, he attacked without fear, fully aware that the monster lacked its former speed. "Wangla!" Tan yelled out, warning him to use caution. It seems the monster lost some of its speed. Lee easily evaded his attack. He planned to use his opponent's frailty as an opportunity to win. The terror and all of his limbs were caught in a web of thorny vines as Lee utilized his other powers. Terror also started absorbing that skill right away, but he was unable to complete it since he was bound in a tangle of enormous, thick vines. Lee sensed his opportunity had arrived. With Tan's assistance, he conjured forth his katana once more. This time it was blazing with flames. As the katana's flames intensified, the same maneuver was employed. He targeted his objective with the jet boot. This time, fear was chained to all of his hands as well, rendering him helpless as our hero dealt a deadly flaming strike. Everything that remained undamaged following the incision was consumed by fire, setting ablaze what he perceived as the lifeless body of the terrifying being trailing behind him. The mission's progress had halted, and he was short by half a point, according to the information window he had checked. Lee exploded in anger. Tommy expressed confusion and wondered if the fear had returned, asking, "What the hell? What kind of ridiculous joke is this?" Looking down at the monster's charred bones was a gamble he wasn't willing to take, but he was astounded by what he saw. Someone enveloped in smoke and fire was found amidst the engulfed remnants of the nightmare. Lee found it hard to believe that it could be real. Yik, his sister, was also present. He was absolutely correct. It was unmistakably her, even though she appeared slightly different. She appeared to be ensnared in this terror, but how did she get here, and what gave her this power? He then yelled out to Tom to take action in a hurry. Suddenly, a plethora of ice fragments encircled his palm and floated in midair. With a yell of freeze, he hurled them at the girl. As soon as it reached the surface, the ice started to dissipate the heat and flames on the coffin, where Yik lay among the rubble. He drew nearer to the spot and started to take off his cloak. He pondered the presence of his sister as he sat down next to the girl and placed it on her. Upon hearing his inquiry, Tom questioned indifferently how she had learned about it before gesturing towards the girl he was already carrying. For confirmation that it was his sister, she questioned Lee. Protagonist couldn't find the words to describe the expression on the face of the sleeping girl in his arms. According to Mrs. Hutter, it was as if she had been conceived in a state of constant fear. Lee was still hoping it was his sister when he heard these remarks, but his extensive life experience made him realize it could have been a trap. A flashback of Yik being dragged away by a man who wailed and pleaded for rescue flashed before the protagonist's eyes. It couldn't be his sister, Lee reasoned after reviewing the evidence. After all, she couldn't transform into a monster. His gaze took on an expression of resolve the second after that. Lee stood up and drew a sword, telling himself not to be fooled because it was probably all an illusion. The protagonist drew his sword, looked down at the girl, who was unconscious on the ground, apologized to her, and then placed his blade on her lovely sleeping face. But the girl's drowsy eyelids popped wide the very next second. Lee was taken aback by this sudden change and inquired as to why she had suddenly regained consciousness. The girl gazed up at the blade before her, her expression betraying her confusion. However, her expression became venomous the second she laid eyes on the man brandishing the weapon. Lee couldn't comprehend the source of her abrupt shift in mood, so he kept staring at her in confusion. The girl whimpered as she stood up and clung to his chest the following second. Even though the protagonist was perplexed by this behavior, he refused to be fooled. He took hold of the girl's head and started to shove her away from him as he icy-facedly told her to stay away, and that she couldn't mislead him. The protagonist, the girl's cloak, revealing some skin, and the awkward pause that followed was met with her perplexed stare at the pointed sword. The girl jerked her body toward the blade, and blood spurted from the wound. The fact that the girl climbed onto the sword herself astonished Lee, who assumed he was going to murder her. The girl continued, nevertheless, and the very next second she encircled the sword in her arms and stabbed herself more forcefully, causing her wound and lips to bleed. The protagonist was met with a melancholy expression from the girl as her violet eyes gleamed. Out of nowhere, she reached up and touched his cheek with her quivering hand. With a gentle smile on her face, she turned to Lee and whispered, "Brody." The protagonist's eyes widened in shock as he stared at the girl in utter confusion. However, the girl quickly closed her eyes and began to slump to the floor. After catching her, Lee took the blade away from her. He finally regained his composure and yelled out an exhortation, warning her that she was on the verge of death if she did not wake up. Tong, who was hovering close by, made the comment that she was a terror anyway, and that he would prefer her death so he could go back to his world. Lee clenched his jaw in response to these statements, because they made him realize that his actions were now motivated solely by emotion. He wanted to grab the girl by the shoulder and drag her away, but then he flashed back to the time she smiled softly at him and called him brother. In the split second after placing his palm on the girl's wound, our protagonist, without even looking back, yelled out to Mrs. Cutter, urging her to apply speedy healing. Almost soon, the girl's wound began to heal as she started to release a green healing light. Even as he watched, Tong couldn't help but think back to the day he had questioned his lord whether he didn't want to go back to his home world. He kept on using healing and explained that he didn't want to murder someone imitating his sister's appearance, so he figured it would be easier to eliminate another terror and finish the assignment. He proceeded to wrap his arm around the girl's shoulder and take her into his arms, remarking that she resembled his sister, and suggesting that they could connect and uncover the truth if they did. Out of nowhere, our hero was told to stop by a voice that came from behind him. The guy with the yellow hair who Lafan had rescued from certain death was the same one. With a hand on his breast, he introduced himself as Wangla and proudly announced his recent promotion to Sank. Then, he proclaimed his admiration for his skills with great volume. He then bowed down and politely requested Lin to accept him as a disciple. Everyone was taken aback by this unexpected change of events, but our hero wasted no time saying no. As Wangla drew nearer, he scratched the back of his head and chuckled nervously. He wanted to know why he wouldn't take him on as a follower. After explaining that he would be leaving this planet soon anyhow, Lin said that the idea was too troublesome for him. The man went on his way, laughing awkwardly upon hearing the response. Irritated that Wangla was still following him after he had made it clear he would not be accepting pupils, the protagonist finally snapped at him and demanded to know why. In response, he indicated that his residence was similarly oriented while scratching the back of his head. Upon reaching the upper floor, Wangel excitedly pointed to the two adjacent apartments and spoke to Lafan's master, assuring him that he had been truthful all along. His irritated response was that he shouldn't refer to him by that name. The protagonist entered his flat and attempted to close the door with his foot, but he was unable. Following closely followed, Wangla began pounding on the door, addressing him as master and pleading for admission, so he could study his skills and get stronger. Unfortunately, his efforts were in vain since the door slammed shut right in front of him, sending him reeling. Following this, Lin's irate voice instructed him to disperse. Wangel's cries resounded from behind the door as our hero delicately set the girl down on the sofa, pleading with him to give it some thought. With a smile, Tan turned to Lin and accused him of being callous. Tan then added that the person was honest. Lin responded by saying he didn't want to be associated with someone from this world. Rising from his knees, the protagonist raised his eyes to the girl sprawled on the couch, a striking resemblance, and remarked, with some contemplation, that he could know where this terror originated. He got up and walked out of the room, planning to take a bath, after staring at the blood-stained floor in his clothes. What would Tong do if the girl wakes up in the middle of his bath? He inquired in a suggestive tone. Since the protagonist had never thought of such a thing before, he thought of it right away. He then raised his hand, which emitted an instant glow of pink light, and used the material, which looked like rubber, to tie the female. Having stated that this ought to be sufficient, he proceeded to the restroom. He failed to perceive that the girl had swiftly regained consciousness and widened her eyes the very next second. Lean got into the bathtub, which was full with water. After removing his clothes, he settled into a cozy position, and with a voice that betrayed his contentment, gushed about how wonderful it felt to rest in the tub after a long, stressful day. Looking over at Tong, who was swimming 100 meters with a grave look on her face, he turned to her and inquired what would happen to her if he went back to his world. She replied that, if such were the case, she would need to locate a new host before turning around and swimming backward. After hearing the response, he inquired about the method utilized to select hosts and the benefits to the system. Looking bored as she rested on the tub's edge, she asked him whether he would believe her if she claimed it. He cocked his head to the side and assured her that was all right if she preferred not to bring it up. Suddenly, the hero heard a bang, which prompted him to look towards the door. Through the hazy glass, he could make out a silhouette, which turned out to be the source of the commotion. Out of nowhere, the door slammed shut and swung open. Suddenly, the girl who had been resting on the sofa behind the door stood up. The sight of the shattered door caused Lean to yell angrily, demanding to know why the door had been shattered. Tong encouraged him not to worry about the door as he kept swimming peacefully, but he irritably said that she was right because he had truly knotted that one up. A finger was raised by the girl as she entered, seemingly attempting to indicate how she escaped. Angry and perplexed, Lean pondered how he might read her expressions and decipher her meaning. Almost immediately after, the girl made a determined dash for the restroom. As she slowly rose to her feet, our heroine irritatedly declared that they could never trust terrors. She disrobed herself. Out of nowhere, she loosened her grip on the cloak, and in the next instant, she spat into the bathtub, leaving Lean speechless. When he noticed the female was comfortable and snug against his chest, he asked Tom if she was trying to entice him with her attractiveness. Tong responded with a small smile, maybe she had duckling syndrome. He went on to explain that this condition occurs when baby birds instinctively develop an attachment to the first animal that appears in their line of vision, which in this case would be their mother. She went on to say that she was happy for him, because he was a father. These remarks jolted our hero into reality, and he promptly banished the girl, warning her not to be mistaken about her identity, because she continued to be a terrifying presence. But when he glanced at the girl again, he couldn't help but notice how innocent and lovely she seemed. Her beauty made his cheeks flush. All of a sudden, he reached down and seized the girl's head, and he lowered it into the water with all the might of his hand. Unaware of the situation, she widened her eyes wide. Tong noticed that Leon was reddening under the collar and wanted to know why he hadn't cut ties with her yet. Leon turned aside and explained that it was best to keep things this way. The protagonist offered the girl his finger as he released her head, and then demanded to know her name. The young woman seemed to pause, as if recalling its significance. However, she eventually responded, her countenance betraying her joy, by saying that her name was Alice. Tong interrupted their joyful mood by inquiring about their planned stay, adding that the water was already chilly. Still flushed from the humiliation and scorching water, Leon responded that it would take some time. The room was filled with the sound of the girl's hair being dried by the hairdryer's leaf fan. Now that he had dried it, he decided it was a good moment to explain why she resembled his sister so much. She turned to the protagonist and inquired, "Alice is your sister?" After setting the hairdryer down, he faced Tong and remarked that her intelligence was plainly lacking. Mrs. Cutter responded by saying that she, too, would likely be unable to provide them with the information they sought. Leon retrieved a hanger full of his clothes, tossed them to the girl, and told her she may wear them until better clothes came along. He turned aside and warned her not to change in front of him when the girl began to change her clothing without paying attention to him. The girl looked down at her clothes after changing and told him she was done. Her lovely figure and charming face made her so alluring that our hero couldn't tear his gaze away. After he regained his composure, he snatched her arm and promised to go clothing shopping with her the next day. The next thing she knew, a rumbling sound emanating from Alice's belly echoed around the room, leaving her bewildered and placing her hands on her tummy. Upon witnessing this, Fang the chief declared that it was the perfect moment to eat. He entered the kitchen and immediately began stocking the refrigerator with an assortment of foods. He got to work in the kitchen after gathering his ingredients. He was obviously quite skilled at it because of the fluidity and rapidity with which he performed the tasks. After what seemed like an eternity, a plethora of dishes that were visually identical to my grandmother's creations materialized before an engorged Alice, whose jaw dropped at the sight of the table. As Leon watched her focus on the rice, he couldn't help but smile warmly to himself and think that she was just like Yike. But then he became very irritated, and he yelled at the girl who had eaten the rice and attempted to swallow the bowl, telling her she couldn't. He eventually confronted Alice, who sat across from him, about the lack of common sense when he noticed the empty dishes following dinner. Pointing to the empty bowl, she said, "I'm not full," with a hint of sadness in her voice. Upon hearing this, our hero wasted no time opening the fridge, only to discover that it was empty. He gave her an irritated expression and wondered when she would have time to consume all of the food he had purchased, but it was too late to go shopping since no stores were open. Simultaneously, a savage-looking man with perspiration all over him was using his powerful arms to hoist weights. As his thrilling moment came to an abrupt end, he cocked his head in surprise as he heard a knock on the door. Upon opening the door, he discovered the man he aspired to be as a student standing behind it, with a girl concealed behind him. In astonishment, he turned to the protagonist and inquired if he had arrived to enroll him in class. He maintained his expression and responded by saying he had never called him such. After that, he pointed to Alice and inquired if she was hungry, adding that the girl ate a lot. Wannell claimed his master and mother could eat all the canned goods and snacks they wanted when he spread them out on the table. The fact that she was not his mother was Wannell's furious response. The sight of the food made Alice's eyes light up, and she stared at it in silence when she was alone with it. The heap of food vanished a second later. Instead, it had slid into the girl's bottomless stomach, and she was happily nibbling on the remnants. It startled them both. Guys, they were taken aback by how fast the food ran out. Wannell was taken aback and wondered how she managed to eat it all in one go. The protagonist, meantime, clenched his fist in frustration and muttered something about how he couldn't possibly eat everything in the package at once. Curling the girl's hair, he questioned how she managed to maintain her slender figure despite her gluttony. In response, Tong remarked enviously that the system was still more attractive. Subsequently, Liam placed his hand on his growling stomach and confessed that he had neglected to consume any food while tending to Alice. Despite the late hour, Wannell smiled and said he knew the perfect spot to eat. Their group eventually came to a brick structure with 2 men stationed at the front door. The man with the yellow hair smiled and asked an acquaintance if he was still on duty today. The location was too loud, he said, and only a powerful man like him could make it quiet again. Allowing them entry, he pried open the door. They lowered themselves down the stairs after Wang. The main character noticed that this grocery store didn't appear to be like any other. Speaking to him as a master, he warned him not to have an incorrect impression of this location based on first impressions. He was overjoyed to welcome them to the subterranean paradise city as he walked up to the entrance and opened it. The sight before Lian and the girl's eyes was a massive auditorium teeming with young people, many of whom were dancing and singing along to the blaring music. The protagonist followed the man with the red hair and questioned him if this location had always been here. When he heard that this place is the responsibility of a very powerful man who is also in the ranks of hunters, he couldn't help but wonder why that man hadn't stepped in to save the city from the terrors. As a result of their assignment from the unified government, W. explained, they were only able to assist if other hunters in the city at the same time expressed an interest in doing so. Upon hearing this, our hero came to the realization that the hunters' internal politics were equally intricate. Upon regaining consciousness and surveying his surroundings, he discovered that Alice had vanished into thin air. Without further ado, he commenced his search for the girl with the red-haired man. He turned around and saw her smack dab in the thick of the throng, but things weren't so cut and dried. A gigantic man stood behind her, his eerie eyes fixed on her. The unattractive man demanded to buy Alice some drinks while grabbing her hand and insulting her by calling her Little Miss. His expression was cruel. As a result of her shock, the girl's eyes widened. When the girl showed no emotion, the man grabbed her hand and demanded to know why she was being hesitant before yelling at her to come to him immediately. Then, gesturing toward the girl's attire, he claimed that she had come here dressed to woo someone. The protagonist finally snapped out of his funk, swore, and stormed over to confront the girl. This image brought up painful memories of things he vowed would never happen again, and he was furious as a result. The girl, however seemingly helpless at first look, proved out to be really resilient. Her threateningly gloomy expression took over the next second. The next thing she knew, she had encircled the man's massive arm, hurled him to the floor, and was yelling angrily for him to break free. A clattering sound accompanied the man's fall to the ground as blood spurted from his mouth. Despite his disbelief, Wannell gushed that it was fantastic. Lian appeared to have forgotten how terrifying she was. Tong told him as he turned to face him. The fact that she was so little made him nervous, he said with a smile. The sound of someone's palm tapping on the table abruptly cut off their discussion. The perpetrator was a big, half-bald man who sat at a table against the wall with many other big men. He stood up from the table and turned to the girl, who he confronted with a furious question about her daring to touch a gang member bald and her desire to leave town. As the protagonist listened, He or she became perplexed and inquired as to why the group was named the Bald Gang since they actually had hair. The individuals displaying their muscles and partially bald heads responded by saying he was confused. They went on to explain that the more bald they were, the stronger they were, to which the man scornfully said that it seemed like they were all weaklings. All of a sudden, they charged the hero with the intention of reprimanding him. Simultaneously, Leon felt the growth of an unusual pink substance in his palm, which, in an instant, transformed into a hammer handle. The hero swung it quickly and forcefully after picking it up with both hands. He slammed the large man next to him so hard that his nose bled, and his eyes curled back in agony. He was thrown backwards like a cannonball by the force of the contact and collided with his gang comrades, who were chasing after him. Consequently, the whole Baldy gang was vanquished with a single strike. With her eyes shining with awe, Alice looked up at Leon and joyfully raised more fingers to the top. Calling him brother, Leon complimented his strength and suggested that she should address him by that name. Wenla, who was both terrified and excited, wanted to know how the hero could use his ability in this situation. The yellow-haired guy responded by saying that if anyone discovered he had used his ability at the club, they would be destroyed. Unfamiliar voices yelled out, "You're already dead," and the men turned to face a towering, chiseled man with a bald spot on his head, who appeared considerably stronger than the previous gang members and was referred to as the Mediterranean Tyrant by his rank in the C rank. Leon turned to Lean and asked if he truly believed that no one could control them. He then approached Wungla, patted him on the face, and asked in a snide voice if he dared to challenge him. When they reached Sank, the protagonist turned to the yellow-haired guy and asked who the old man was. The yellow-haired guy replied that he was the Mediterranean Tyrant Lo Weong, leader of the bald-headed gang in a city. Hearing this, the protagonist was taken aback by the abundance of bald men in this world, as they even had their own secret offices. But his train of thought was abruptly interrupted by the gang leader, who drew nearer and insulted him in a nasty way. Clenching his huge fist, the leader smiled nastily and threatened to spare him from punishment if he didn't comply. Lean, unfazed by the threat and staring at the gang leader coldly, asked what would happen if he didn't. The gang leader grinned evilly in response to the protagonist's words. Then, in an angry outburst, he yelled at him to go to hell and swung his fist at him, but it was interrupted by a chilling female voice that ordered him to stop. The voice belonged to a stunningly beautiful woman, who wore a figure-hugging dress that the men in the vicinity could not tear their gazes away from. Her accompanying guard swiftly made way for her. With a curl in her hand, she threatened to reveal those who had the audacity to trespass on her domain. The big guy, with an awkward smile, greeted her, calling her boss in. He then pointed to our couple and said, "That little thing was the first to start, so I had to intervene." Upon hearing his words, she approached the protagonist, who appeared unconcerned, and asked him coldly if the big guy was telling the truth. However, WL stepped in and politely requested that the woman not be angry and forgave them, explaining that his teacher was unaware of the rules and didn't want to offend her. After taking another drag, she addressed him like a bothersome child and asked him how long it had been since he had a teacher. He attempted to smile and responded that it had been quite recently. In the next moment, the bald gang leader leaned over to the woman and said that their gang would pay double damages if she would just make one small request. The woman remained silent and didn't inquire as to the nature of the request. The man then pointed an accusing finger at Alice, who was attempting to stuff a bowl of apples into her mouth, and told the woman that she was the one who started it all, and that he wanted her to let him deal with her personally. As soon as the girl heard her name, she turned her head to see who was calling her. Lean's expression turned icy and dismal as he heard the big man's words, and he moved determinedly towards Alice. Wla wanted to stop him, telling him not to act rashly, as he was sure that he would be able to negotiate, but he was not going to stop and gloomily walked past Bosnia and the gang leader, who looked at him in surprise. When he approached Alice, Lean immediately took away the bowl she was trying to swallow, irritatedly reminding her that he had already told her not to eat the dishes. At this disrespectful behavior of the guy, a vein of anger swelled on the woman's face, as she couldn't understand how he could not be nervous in her presence. Turning to him, she asked the protagonist if he had heard the proposal. He continued to squeeze Alice's cheeks, who was still trying to get her bowl back, and replied that he had heard everything perfectly well. Hearing this, she told him in a cold voice to drag the girl to her. "Then if I don't?" he asked in a cold voice, looking at the woman. The bandit leader heard his words and grinned, asking why he was so angry, adding that they weren't going to do anything to them now. However, the smile on his face was replaced by horror the next moment, as the strong hand of the protagonist grabbed him by the face. Then, lifting the big man off the ground, Lean said in a cold voice that he could try if he wanted to. However, their pleasant pastime was interrupted by Bosnia, who turned to the protagonist and asked how dare he do such a thing in front of her. After letting out a huge cloud of smoke that enveloped her from all sides, she added in a cold and gloomy voice. That her name didn't mean anything. Upon hearing this, our heroine questioned whether the woman indeed possessed such immense power. She was known as Nino Smoker and placed 108th in the B rankings, so it was no surprise that he enthusiastically responded that she was. The woman let out a heavy smoke as she could no longer bear to be treated in this manner. Suddenly, a spear-like object materialized and swooped down on Lian, who was clinging to the large man. Wang Del yelled out to his master to duck as he became terrified at the sight of the impending threat. Nevertheless, Wang Del persisted in standing there, staring at the spear as it approached. The very next second, the gang leader's own agonizing groan, and the sound of flesh being cut could be heard. He was so fatigued that he started to let go of Fun, and blood spurted out of his mouth. His lifeless body started to fall to the ground as the protagonist released the giant, who had his stomach pierced by the woman's smoke strike. But that wasn't the end of it. The clouds materialized from the man's torso and shaped into a claw paw that charged directly at the hero. The attack was unexpected, but he dove under it anyhow. Even when the subsequent one failed to follow suit, smoke started to fill the hall. It was at last safe for the large man to collapse to the floor. From behind a massive cloud of smoke, the woman emerged and told Fan, "There's no need to talk nonsense." Fan then asked the woman why she was being so malicious to her ally. Taking her hand, which was clutching a pipe out of the smoke, she yelled out to her smoke mask and other protective gear. In response to her remarks, a legion of helmeted knights with swords fashioned from smoke rushed toward the protagonist, charging in unison to take him down. He scowled at the sword, which he easily sidestepped with a tiny movement of his hand. He then leaped into the air, seemingly appearing just above the defenders, who were perplexed as to how he could move so swiftly. After that, Lian instructed the system to activate the skill directly. In the subsequent second, a small amount of energy started to build up in his hands, but the second he brought them together, it burst into a hurricane that vanquished all of the smoke defenders that had been fighting him. Others did not waste a single second of this divinely sent opportunity, even while some shrieked in terror. Ba Sen and the guards materialized behind them as the smoke cleared, shielding themselves from the wind with their hands. Their tightened teeth betrayed their obvious displeasure with this opposition. While Alice mindlessly devoured the complimentary snacks, Wanli eagerly expressed his admiration for his teacher and gave her a thumbs up. In contrast, the woman refused to accept defeat and glared at the hero, claiming that wind was really her greatest enemy. But that wasn't all. She also sprang for Lian while engulfed in smoke, which was a major advantage. Gesturing toward him, she launched an assault with her smoke-enhanced leg, all the while smirking and claiming that Banks possessed more than just psychic powers. Nevertheless, he maintained his expressionless demeanor, and apathetically suggested that the system employ the iron body skill. It was too late for Ba Sen to stop him when she heard his remarks. Her jaw dropped in shock and dismay at the meaning. Lian, whose hand had transformed into iron, grabbed her knee and boasted about his proficiency in hand-to-hand combat. However, his pitiful speech came to a sudden halt when he turned red and averted his gaze. Holding onto her leg, he peered into an inappropriate area and questioned, in a state of embarrassment, if she intended to remain standing like that. She felt a flush of embarrassment and swore at him as she recognized her error. She then yelled at him to stop and swung her pipe, which, due to the smoke, transformed into a blade and was pointed squarely at the protagonist's neck. She sprang out of his grasp and attempted to launch herself into the air in an angry rage, attacking him from above. But in the next second, he succeeded in blocking her sword, and just reflected it with his ire-covered palm, making her furrow her jaw even more. She leaped back to a safe distance and set off a smoke explosion, after realizing she had little chance of defeating him in close combat. Although the protagonist skillfully evaded it by leaping into the air, he had no intention of continually defending himself in this manner. Then, as he stood in the middle of a reddish-brown substance, he raised a hand and ordered the system to employ binding. Consequently, the girl was taken aback the following minute when she found herself chained and unable to move or do anything. She yelled at the terrified bodyguards to stop asking if she was okay, and that they would assist her. Proceed with less fury than previously. She turned to the protagonist and demanded to know his rank and identity. He casually rubbed his head and introduced himself as Loon, a hunter-ranked deer. Bosnia clenched her jaw in frustration as she studied the man, perplexed by the system's incorrect assessment of his strength. Was he in fact a deer-ranking hunter? A noise broke the silence, emanating from the spot where the large man should have been laying. They looked up and were startled to see that he was still alive and could get up. With a grin on his face, the protagonist shifted to face him and inquired whether he wanted to continue fighting. However, he suddenly heard Wangli yelling at him to avoid. But Loon couldn't take his eyes off the large man, who had grown even larger in an instant, and was now standing motionless as he tried to make sense of what had transpired. The protagonist, who had been motionless up until this point, screamed in agony as the former gang leader's massive fist pounded on his immobile stomach. With his maniacal yelling and fists winging the once manly leader of the bald group now resembled a ravenous zombie ghoul. It seemed like even our hero would have a tough time defeating him.